and practice-based research. Violist Emlyn Stam is active as a chamber musician, soloist, pedagogue and performance researcher in the Netherlands and internationally. Since 2014, he has been artistic director of the New European Ensemble, which is an international ensemble for contemporary and 20th century music. As a soloist, Emlyn Stam has made numerous appearances for Dutch radio and television. He performed concertos with the Amsterdam Symphony Orchestra, Orchestra d'Espino in Portugal, and the Schönberg Ensemble. Emlyn has also performed at numerous festivals, such as Festival Vlaanderen, the Kumo Festival in Finland, Sound of Stockholm, Connect Festival, Giverny Chamber Music Festival, International Chamber Music Festival Utrecht, and Grachten Festival Amsterdam. His many chamber music performances have included concerts with the Parkani Quartet and regular appearances with the Isai Trio, of which he is a founding member. The trio released 2 CDs for the Dutch record company. As a teacher, Emlyn regularly gives master classes in both viola and chamber music. He taught at numerous conservatories in the Netherlands, Estonia, China, and Sweden. He currently teaches at the Fontys University for the Arts in Tilburg. Emlyn is an active music researcher and completed his doctorate at the Academy for Creative and Performing Arts at the Leiden University in 2019 with a dissertation In Search of a Lost Language, performing in early recorded style in viola and string quartet repertoires. His research focuses on late 19th and early 20th century performance practices. He is regularly invited to give guest lectures on his research, such as at the University of Leeds, the Hochschule der Künste in Bern, and the Royal Conservatoire in The Hague. Emlyn Stam's dissertation can be found on the website linked down below. A playlist with musical recordings made for his research can be found down below. Please enjoy this interview with Emlyn Stam. What drives you as an artistic researcher or artist and researcher, and how do you engage with those ideas in your performance and in your research?
So what drives me, that goes back to why I started doing research in the first place, which is that I always had this passionate love for historical recordings, early recordings, and I would listen to these old recordings, old records from the pre-war period, from the beginning of the 20th century. I was really fascinated by the musicians, how they approached performance practice there. And I was always curious about how does it work if you experiment a little bit with yourself, with some of these techniques or stylistic ideas, and why are so many of the things that I'm taught, as you know, in a conservatory context, or later, why are so many of the things that I'm supposed to do as a professional musician in chamber music and in orchestra limiting the ability to use these techniques, or why is this looked on as something really not appropriate anymore? Because we always have this discussion that we hear, oh yeah, this is such a lovely old recording, but you can't play that way anymore. So my response to that was, why not? You know, what's the problem? So that's really what drove my interest in research, was like this conviction that I developed that we had some way of making music as a culture that we sort of lost along the way due to various historical and cultural developments, and that if we could learn something from those recordings, that might be able to free us from some of this feeling of living in a straitjacket that many of us experience as classical musicians. You know, that we have a predefined style for each composer, and it's supposed to sound like this, and there's a predefined standard which is based on digitally edited recordings, which means that you have to reach a certain kind of technical cleanliness and perfection as well. And these kind of things can amount to the feeling that the performer doesn't matter anymore. It could be anyone playing, it doesn't matter, and they're their person doesn't matter, or their opinion or their feeling. And I thought this was very different on the historical recordings, where there was a very wide range of possibilities. So I thought, this is an interesting way to see if you can use that to open up creative channels for performance today, and what would happen if you do that. That was basically how I got on this path, let's say.
What does it mean to be a performer in your own body and in your own experience and in your own world?
That's pretty broad. What does it mean? I mean, this is a difficult thing to talk about, also in a research sense, because you're speaking about kind of sensory perception of how you physically perceive things that you're doing, how you hear things that you're doing, how you see things that you're doing. So this kind of perception does not translate easily into words, unless you say have a theoretical framework for it. And some of it is also just a mental or emotional experience of playing an instrument. And I guess, what I could say about it with regard to artistic research is that you're in a way finding words to somehow communicate that to other people, so they might have some understanding of what it feels like for you to play something in a particular way, and how you experience that when you hear yourself doing it, or when you hear yourself back playing something on a recording. For me, recordings were a very important part of, and they still are an important part of the research process. Not merely as a form of documentation, but I think also that the way that we record music is never ideologically neutral. So whatever setup or microphone or acoustic or whatever you use already is adding a certain information, a sensory layer to your playing as you record. I did a lot of work with Jeff Miles from the Norwegian radio, and he developed these microphones that he built himself that work as an almost like an acoustic recording horn without having to do the whole acoustic process. I know there are some people who are doing this acoustic process. There was one woman in London who was actually recording wax rolls and stuff like this, which is also very interesting. But it, of course, comes with a lot of technological know-how and difficulty. And of course, the benefit of having a microphone, which is a kind of lo-fi setup, is that it does allow you to translate to digital and to have this perception of, I play something and I can listen back. And I was very interested in this recording process, like what kind of feedback do recordings give you? So when you're in a modern recording studio, let's say, with very hi-fi microphones, I always feel like the feedback you're getting from the recording is also sending your playing in a certain direction, which is like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but then you have a microphone close to you and it picks up all these high frequencies and you hear every little scratch. So you try to clean out the sound as much as possible. And if there's something like a little bit not matching in intonation, it's very bothersome and you want to correct it and edit it and so on. And all of this is creating a certain palette of perception and also of playing, let's say. Whereas if you do it in a different way, you do it in a much more limited way, record yourself and just stick to the mid-range frequencies, which is where a lot of the sort of sense of movement in music is occurring, then you're not so busy as a performer with these ideas of little scratches or little blemishes or whatever, and you start to focus on these bigger expressive qualities become more important. So gesture becomes more important in your playing. And this is one thing that I thought about a lot, actually. And I talked with a lot of different musicians, players, and researchers both about this idea that you ask about perception and about experience. It's impossible to experience and to do everything when you're playing music, right? So in some sense, we do have to make choices. So we cannot focus only on clean sound and perfect tuning and precise rhythm as notated and so on, and then expect that we will also get, gesture and unpredictability and the spontaneity and other aspects, right? So whenever you put your focus as a performer on certain aspects, you are neglecting other aspects, and you have to make trades there. And I think that's something that we talk about too little, perhaps as musicians, because we somehow expect of ourselves that we should reach some kind of godlike standard, which digital recordings are constantly giving to us. The truth is, really focus on what it is you want to do. And if you really believe that communication is the most important part about playing music, then the focus should be on how do you convey that message and what do people respond to as a message. And probably is not like super, super unblemished quality of tone, which is going to convey gesture and affect and or, you know, emotionality or whatever character, what have you. So
what is the publication that you could recommend to the artistic research communities, publication in a very broad sense, and self-promotion encouraged?
Well, I think one of the most important resources for performing musicians and people who are doing research on music, especially in this kind of Western canon of whatever we call classical or art music, is the website challengingperformance.com from Daniel Leach Wilkinson. For myself, I also found his previous book, The Changing Sound of Music, as well as Beyond the Score by Nicholas Cook. But they also open up ideas or suggestions for performative research or for a kind of performative turn where we really focus on what is happening in this communication from performer to listener and what can performers do and just how huge our role is actually in communicating music. Because without sounding music and without a culture of sounding music, then all of this text and all of these written scores are kind of perfectly meaningless artifacts, right? So I think they both did an incredibly important job in sort of leading the way and setting a theoretical foundation for a lot of the performative research that's happening today, and also some of the investigation of historical recordings, but also in contemporary music and in other musical genres, and kind of embracing a bit of a wider view of what this whole idea of performance means.
What was your favorite thing that you learned during your doctorate?
Basically, I was also kind of one of the reasons I went through Orpheus is because of their connection with Daniel Leach Wilkinson, but also because of Dr. Anna Scott. She was my supervisor. And I was very also lucky to hear a lecture of hers on her work. She was working on the late Brahms Intermezzi. Her argument was the one that I sort of took up, which was basically, we have all of this text-based resources and this historical performance practice with old instruments and so on and so forth. And we also have all these modern players claiming to be true to the composer, playing on modern instrument or whatever, and they following the score and the research and so on. But these two things don't sound anything like the historical recordings from the period. So we have a problem here, because we're then claiming that we're being so-called true to the composer and the score, but we're ignoring the composer's recordings and we're ignoring all of his students and so on. So the question becomes, why is that? And I think the answer is a bit nuanced, but the importance there is the reason this is happening is because a lot of the things that are happening on those recordings are things we don't really like too much aesthetically, or they're posing severe challenges to the so-called competence which is expected from us as modern performers, or they're posing challenges to the research because they're going right against the written text of the treatises or the notated score. In her case, I mean, she focused a lot on Ilona Eibenschütz, who was a pupil of Brahms. And she, in her recordings, just kind of ignores things. She improvises some materials. When it says ritardando, she speeds up. When it says accelerando, she slows down. Stuff like this, you know, it's like, it becomes really interesting. And then you think, yeah, but actually there was this whole performance practice, which is documented on recordings. And you start to take the whole body of it, like hundreds and hundreds of recordings from this era. And you start to see the same things repeated over and over again in different ways. So then the thought arises like, okay, but this was kind of a period, a style of playing in which people really didn't take the score all too literally, but also all of these theoretical constructs that we created in historical performance practice. In many cases, there's like a gap between what people are telling you to do in methods about playing. For example, we take portamento with string players. All of the treatises from 19th century say, yeah, portamento, you know, lovely device, but you should use it very sparingly and so on. And then we go to the recordings and it's sometimes just every single interval, or one in every 3 intervals, is played with a slide. So there's a huge gap there between these texts and the practice. So then we can ask all kinds of questions. Are we reading these texts in a modern context, so we don't understand them the way somebody understood them in a context where this portamento was used a lot more? Do people just ignore these instructions and they thought it was nonsense? Who knows? I mean, you can evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. So anyway, this was the work Anna was doing on Brahms. I was very inspired by that also, because she made these very detailed copies of these recordings. She went in and she really, she came to just inhabit them and to basically, she spoke about it as embodying, reenacting these performances. And I thought this is a very interesting method, because you can go very precisely and you can observe, you can analyze what's happening, and you can reenact it through your body yourself. Then at least you can gain some insight. I mean, you can know, number one, that you're, by comparing what you've done with the original, whether you're actually doing these things to the extent that you say you are, because we have so many examples in research of performers saying, yeah, I'm doing all this portamento and I do all these wild tempo modifications just like on these recordings, and then you listen to the performance and it's just not true. They think that they went very far, but they didn't, because we're being stopped, as it were, by our need for professionalism or the culture around us, which will, our training, is getting in the way. So you can really compare and you can say, okay, I'm actually doing this. But you can also say something about the experience. What is it like to play in that way? What do you experience when you work in a chamber music context with colleagues and you play that way, as I did? So yeah, that was my path, as it were. That's how it fit or didn't fit. Yeah. I mean, you asked about the Orpheus Institute and Leiden University. I mean, in a sense, most of the artistic research happening around is really early music, so 17th century, maybe the 18th century, even earlier, and contemporary music. So this area is still a little bit of a small, tiny group of people that are working on it. Yeah.
But you seem to have found exactly the right people to work with. So it sounds like a real win-win, that you had Anna Scott and that you had the people around you who really helped you to develop that topic.
One of the struggles I faced, and I think a lot of musicians faced, especially through Orpheus, is and Leiden University, is the very high academic standards that are put on the PhD. If you're conservatoire trained, so you went when you're 18 to the conservatoire and you didn't do this kind of academic training, and you have a bachelor and a master, whatever, maybe you did some small research in your master, but cannot be compared with a PhD. So you come into this kind of gap where it's like, actually, if somebody's doing PhD in psychology or whatever, they've probably written like 5 papers or 6 papers. They had things published. They were like, they've done this type of writing for years through their master and through whatever. And then PhD is just a big version of the same. But for us, it's like starting something from nothing, basically, because the last time I wrote something serious was like a little bit in my master, and before that was like in high school, right? So I was extremely lucky in that regard as well, to work with Anna, because she was really like just very, very stringent and strict, and said, okay, look, this is the standard, like, and gave some tools and techniques for writing as well, basic things that you don't think of, but some resources, like, okay, look at this. Who was it again? Pat Thompson. I don't know if you know her, but she is she's kind of the PhD whisperer, I would say. She has a website, and she teaches something like education research in Australia. It's completely like, but she writes this beautiful blog about how to deal with all these aspects of PhD writing.
And so how is it for you teaching artistic research?
I mean, the teaching part is it's just a great pleasure always, because yeah, I'm in a conservatory environment. I have a very small role in some doctoral projects, let's say outside the institute where I work. I work at the Fontys University for the Arts in Tilburg, which is basically an art school which has many different art disciplines, but I work in the master and the bachelor of music. And with regard to the artistic research teaching, I get a very diverse kind of body of students. They have all types of different subject areas that they deal in. So along the way, you manage to pick up a lot of knowledge, or you learn a lot about things which are not part of your immediate domain of specialization. And it's one of the things I always criticized when I was a student at Orpheus. It's so funny how these things come back to bite you when you get older. But I thought, I have to sit through these seminars and these conferences about like Renaissance music, and then you come back and you're a supervisor and you're like, hey, I remember that guy from over there, and that's the perfect person for my student now, you know? Or you make all these connections. You're like, hey, I do know something about basso continuo in the Netherlands in the late 17th century. I can help this student now, you know. Yeah. So it just shows that having this kind of broad perspective and actually kind of getting a general scope of what's going on, not only is it interesting and it develops you as a human being and you know more about the world, but also you never know when you can pass that knowledge on to others and help them out, especially if you turn around and come into a teaching position. It's no longer about what I'm interested in. It's about how do I help you as a student to, you know, reach the potential that you have, or reach the goal that you have with your research, right? So
how do you deal with the somewhat tricky methodology part in artistic research, or methods, when you're with your students? Do you send them to particular methods? Do you just see what works in a case to case?
Yeah, so first of all, here we have always a semantic problem of what is a method, what is a methodology, what is a research strategy. I don't know if you read the article by Dr. Falk Hübner and Joost van Malen in Forum Plus, but they have a great article about this problem, which I always think back on, because I think the solution they propose is a very good one, which is they made a drawing with 3 circles, and on the outer circle is methodology, with the idea that this is the overarching. So this is like qualitative, quantitative, like the big things, right? In between you have like a research strategy, like how am I going to approach this whole area? And then in this small circle in the center, you have your methods, which are like the concrete things that you do to answer your research problem or your research question. So I always think of this as a nice way to think about it. And what you're really after is those methods, I think, mostly when you're busy with research. And the thing that I always say is the method has to be the appropriate one for answering the question or the query or approaching the problem. And yeah, this we just borrow, we mix the methods and choose and steal or whatever we need from whatever discipline happens to be appropriate. But many of the methods are similar. I mean, it's going to be art practice usually in the center of your method. So it will be, performing, recording, experimenting in some way, I don't know, composing, whatever it is, arranging, and then reflecting in some sense on that, right? I mean, those are going to be probably your most important ones, next to reading or whatever other things you happen to incorporate. I mean, I've also had students to incorporate things from really far disciplines, whether it's like computer science or medical science or whatever, but then it of course becomes necessary that it's appropriate and related to the performance practice element, number 1, and number 2, that you don't tread so far outside of your expertise that you're making nonsense conclusions with tools that you don't know how to use. So I always recommend, in the case that you're going to do something with a medical researcher or a biologist or whatever, that you get somebody who is an expert, and then you get them to work together with you, or create some kind of symbiotic project where your artistic project is supporting their medical research, and you can use their knowledge of medical research to support whatever claims you want to make in your artistic project, let's say. So, I mean, that's, I think, the general approach when it comes to methods, in my mind.
Yeah, such a beautiful approach, and also very clear. I can tell that you're working with a lot of students and that you're talking about these things on a day-to-day basis, and it's really nice. So in the last few years, there has been this trend of putting the performers, the artists' lived experience really into the research, into the publication, really disclosing the self and really putting like your own identity out there. And with these methods that some people do, like autoethnography and things like that, there are tools that one can do that, and like students here right now that are really into like exploring queer identities and just kind of being really open and diverse in all possible ways, they have kind of enjoyed this part where you're putting not only like your practice, you're really putting yourself as an object of research, and then documenting what you do, and then looking at that pile of documentation collected over some time. Like, I wonder if you can comment on whether you've had those kinds of people, you know, cases of people wanting to do that kind of research, how you teach that, or where maybe some source you can recommend, or some experience that you've had, or maybe just it's not what I typically do. I'm more like, you know, in the directions that you've already mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting and important development in a way, and I think it's tied with cultural issues and let's say politics and social development, which is an interesting turn, let's say, because we've noticed something within this artistic research. I'm this kind of old-fashioned version of it, where it's like we're really involved with information, you know, whether that information is like recorded or it's textual or it's experiential or whatever. It's my work has always been about information and communication, and how can you use information to communicate performances in a certain way, which is a very traditional way of doing things. But I notice also this new development, especially amongst younger students, that there's a lot of interest in how do I as an artist relate with, for example, climate catastrophe, or queer identity, or racial politics, or national identity, all of these kind of hot button issues which are determining the course of the 21st century right now. And I think that's potentially a very interesting development, both for performance practice, art practice, and for artistic research, because it's very much about what can we say something from like a musical perspective about these things, and what does the artist have to add to meteorological research about weather and climate change, to activism, to legal challenges, to current frameworks. Is there something to be said from the artistic perspective? This is very interesting, and especially in music, because music is, I mean, if we exclude text, if we think about just instrumental music or whatever, always thought of as an abstract medium. But you see this great tendency amongst composers, performers, and so on, to go in a direction of social political engagement, which I think is interesting and important in a way, and maybe is steering also this whole field of artistic research in a new and different direction. Yeah, so I guess we will see with time what that means, but it's interesting to see that this engagement is really, really back on the menu, and that we are not thinking of ourselves as isolated in an ivory tower from society, but this kind of how does it interact with the world question is really prominent all of a sudden.
I think that was also such a rich response. Thank you so much for sharing this personal view and your experience of how you find this shift in the humanities, how that might be a potential also for artistic research.